Hello everyone, this is Master Viktor Neustroev, and today we are conducting our next workshop. Today the topic is how to play simple positions. So first of all, you need to understand what simple positions are and of course which approach to take. Well, those of you who prefer attacking in all games this time should forget about the attack on the king, but instead should focus on some other plans. Which plans? This is what we are going to discuss. However, let's wait for more students to join our workshop. So people are joining. So we will wait for a little, maybe a few minutes. So this workshop is definitely not about the attack. It's about planning. It's about strategic decisions. It's about taking advantage of weaknesses, and maybe, yes, you can then attack the enemy king in some positions if it makes sense. Okay, so thanks for joining. So Caroline, do you attend this workshop for the first time? If yes, can you please introduce yourself a little? For example, tell me which country you're from and what's your current ELO. It can be either FIDE rating, national rating, or chess.com ELO, if you have. So let's wait for a couple more minutes. Your microphone doesn't work. Okay, you can just type it in the chat, like country and rating. Well, why is it important for me? Well, if you don't want to share your country, it's fine. But your rating, because I want to understand what's your level of understanding, and this helps me uh, mm, to explain material better. For example, if you are like 1800, then I don't really need to explain the details because you, of course, understand them. If you're 12, then some details should be covered, some not. Okay, from Sweden, perfect. Currently unrated. Okay, so, but you have a chess.com account and you play there, right? Okay, perfect. Okay, so well, what else you need to know? This workshop is a recording, and tomorrow you're going to get the recording of this event. I think I'm going to also make a post with all the PGNs of the games that we are going to analyze. For today, I prepared 3 games, but if we have more time, we can go over the fourth one that I also prepared, but I'm not planning to show it to you. Moreover, some of you, those who attend my group classes on Fridays, may have seen it. Okay, let's start. Oh, yes, your microphone is working. Yes, it's fine. Yeah. Okay, perfect. I'm sure you will enjoy the event. Maybe you'll find it a little more difficult. If so, don't hesitate to ask any questions. You're welcome. Okay, so let's start. So Brian asked, why is this the starting position? Is it a critical point? Yes, kind of. It's a critical point. Why? Why do I say so? What does it mean? It means that here we have the end game. It's a multi-piece end game. The pawn structure is asymmetric, illegal asymmetric, and white, if white wants to play for win, should come up with a proper plan. And for many of you, coming up with a plan can be an issue here. I have several ideas of what white can do, but I want to listen what you suggest. Definitely, there is no any precondition that tells you that you should attack this king. So forget about the king attack. First, because it is the end game. Second, because the king is not compromised. There is no winning plan, to be honest. There is a plan which improves the white's position and can potentially provide white with some winning chances and provoke black to make mistakes. So the position is approximately equal. White is just very, very little better. And if two engines are playing, the game ends in a draw. Okay, so then suggest the minority attack on the queen side. That's a good point. Yes, if you can exchange these two for these three, then you play the endgame with 5 versus 4, and this is what you can win. So that's why the minority attack, in order to create weaknesses. But what exactly to start with? So you can start with knight a5 move. Well, h3 with the idea of doing g4 is interesting, but h3, h5 just. So let's start with knight a5. b7 is the pawn that we would like to capture. Once we take it, the c6 becomes a weakness. And of course, they have to defend it. In the game, Isaac Kashdan, who was playing it with black pieces, continued with bishop c8, putting the bishop to maybe a passive position. Maybe not so, because on f5 the bishop is not really doing much. But you may ask me, what happens if he does rook d7? Okay, the rook on d7 is the object of the attack, and this time we may consider playing knight a4, knight c5, and taking it then. Right? This and this. So in order to stop it, they maybe try this move. And this is where both players had to calculate a very sharp line with f3. Because if f3, the knight moves, it can be e4. Okay, Erosh, if knight comes to c5, it's already taking the rook, so there is no time for b6. What happens here? So f3, let me just show you this line. It's hard to calculate, but for GM, it's possible to see. If you are not a GM and you don't want to calculate, you cannot evaluate. Instead of f3, you can choose something else. For example, you can, let's say, trade bishops, play this move, and keep adding pressure on the enemy position, considering f3 later. Because when you move the rook to c1, after knight e3, your rook on f1 is not hanging. But let me show you the line that I want. So f3, if the knight moves, it's e4. However, knight e3 is the most competitive move here. F takes e4, knight takes f1, bishop takes f1, bishop takes e4, and it seems that actually it's rook for 2 minor pieces, but it's not only it's not only a rook, it's also 3 extra pawns. Not 3, 2. 2 extra pawns in the rook for 2 knights, which is fine. But there is knight c5. However, a counterattack for knight c5 is rook d4, which makes the rook poisoned. So now bishop d4, bishop takes d4 check, and the knight on c5 is lost, and black is winning. That's why here white should continue with bishop g7, trade bishops, and knight a b3. What's the concept of knight to a b3? This knight is attacking e4, so the rook has to move to the position from which it can defend the bishop. The only position I see is this, but it's not the very end. a3, the rook goes there, and knight a5. The bishop is still hanging, and we want to trap the rook as well as deliver a fork, which means that after bishop d5, knight a4, and this trade, when it happens, this knight retreats, of course, white has extra knight, which is compensated by only 3 pawns. Usually 3 pawns are considered to be approximately equal to the knight, but this is already the end game. The pawns are not advanced, and that's why it will be winning for white. So white calculated this long line and figured out that he is fine with this. Black did calculate it too and realized that rook d7 is a bit suspicious because it provokes knight c5. That's why they played bishop c8. Bishop c8, bishop f3. Just improving the bishop, preparing for e4. h5. So h3 prophylaxis, because we take this square under our control, our bishop can retreat to h2 if needed, and our king gets an escape square again later in the endgame once we open more files. Knight h7 was played. What do you think? The question for you. So take or not to take? And if not to take, then which move to play? So what are your suggestions for trading bishops and against trading bishops? Okay, Brian suggests knight takes knight. Well, okay, so knight takes knight on d5. You mean, of course, it should be calculated, but what do you achieve with this? Because originally, the idea was to try to trade these two pawns for these three. So if you do this, the pawn structure becomes symmetrical. And if you then don't see any concrete benefits, for example, your rook invasion to the 7th rank, then why did you do this? Bishop c7 and knight c6, but how can you play knight c6 if there is a pawn on b7? Okay. So trading the knights, can you please remove this this arrow? I can remove it myself, of course. Okay. Looking at knight e4. Let me show you. So c takes. What then? Bishop takes bishop or bishop c7? Okay, bishop c7, rook d7. Your bishop is fine. Okay, so it would be great if you, instead of drawing, just write down the move and explain why. Write down in the chat. Okay, fine. So rook a to c1 here, it's definitely playable, but what then? Then bishop b8, but bishop b8, that's a6. So what did you achieve? Bishop b8, yes, but a6. And even if they play b6 and you invade the enemy camp with knight e6, what do you really achieve here? So this move, I think they can even play this. Knight a7, yeah, maybe, well, knight a7, then rook b8. Bishop a7, but you have the c6 hanging. So it doesn't seem to work. Well, I don't see the point of knight d5. You'd better let them take, because it opens the b file for you and you can attack the weakness on b7. So, well, how do I decide whether I should trade pieces or not? What I need to do here is to compare. Take bishops. So I need to compare my bishop and the enemy bishop and the effect that this bishop do for this bishop on g7 does for the white's position. So I would say by retreating the bishop to g3 or to h2, for example, I still make my bishop active. I can invade c7, I can invade b8 in some positions, but this bishop is restricted by the pawn. Here you may consider doing c5, but you cannot play c5 because the knight is hanging, and if you trade first and then play c5, then I'll keep the pawn structure as it is. Look, like that. And this bishop is still restricted. It's definitely a more worse piece compared to the bishop on h2, which has a diagonal. By the first glance, you may see that this bishop is not really doing much, but no, he does much. He is taking the control over c7, and potentially he is going to b8 to attack the pawn on a7, while this bishop doesn't have prospects. So only e5 helps him, but e5 means a pawn sacrifice, which should be counted first. So compare bishops. If you can keep your bishop active, but the enemy bishop is passive, why do you trade? Well, so that's why I wouldn't trade. In the game, they also played this move, knight to bishop h2. So the control over b8. For example, if this happens, then with rook b1 we are attacking b7, but they don't have rook b8. In variations, not in this exact position. Of course, the rook cannot jump over the bishop, but rook b8 can be required. Anyway, knight g5 was played, chasing this bishop away. Why? Because they wanted to play c5. How should we deal with it? Because now the pawn on d4 is an object of the attack, and we definitely should take care about this pawn. Taking there means we lose on c3. Pawn takes, then the bishop becomes active. It also can be a fork. So what to play? Take maybe. But then d4 is still under attack. What would you suggest? Okay, Ben suggests knight there, but well, I understand. What if they take? Then knight d4. Okay, but then knight c3, and well, this pawn structure, the pawn is a weakness on c3. Knight e4 is coming. So is it really good? Let's say knight e4. You have to defend it. f3 now? Well, f3 when? In which position? If you play f3 here, you just blunder a pawn. So rook c1 is a must. But then they will add pressure. There is knight d2, knight c4, which sets a very nice blockade, for example. Okay, let me wait for f3. So which move I can play? I would like to activate this bishop, but I don't see an opportunity of doing it. Let me try b6 first. Is knight c6 a problem? Maybe. Okay, then e5 can be played. e5, the knight moves and the bishop comes to e6. This is a possibility. The second possibility is just to play a6, for example, with the idea of doing b5. And let's say f3 now. Knight d2, rook f2, knight c4. e3 is hanging. The knight is a very nice piece that blockades the enemy activity. For example, these moves are unavailable and the pawn is blocked. Black can trade bishop for a knight. When? No. If in this position they trade, then white improves their pawn structure. Here, it also improves the pawn structure. It's not a good strategy. So knight b3, no. Instead of knight b3, you can play better. Who can suggest a better move? How to deal with this weakness? Knight e2. Well, knight e2 looks a little passive, but maybe it does work. Knight e2. They take. You have to take with a knight. They can take with their bishop, and this is isolated pawn. For example, knight e6, and you have to defend it. You can try this, but f6. No, doesn't look like a... Well, knight b3, there is a defense, but it doesn't look like a promising position. So, bishop b3, this move was played in the game. Why? With bishop b3, we are taking on d5. That's why they don't have time to capture, because we take. And if in this position they take on c3, we can take with our b pawn and reinforce the center. This is still a favorable pawn structure for us, and we still keep the enemy bishop bad. So we don't need to trade. If we trade, the position becomes simple and we have to start everything from the very beginning. We have to look for our pieces activity, trying to get the rook to the c file, invading c7, which is really hard. So, but with bishop b3, we provoke them to take. They did take. If they did something else, then we would win a pawn. And this still looks fine for us. The pawns are isolated, but we can play c6. So, for example, knight a6 attacking the pawn, we can push c6. And this is how we save the pawn. Also, we may intend to play to c7 to get it closer to the queen in square. For example, b6. Well, I don't know if c7 right now is a good idea, because after rook d7 I wanted bishop a4, but then my knight is hanging. So that's why let me just retreat and replace my knight to e5. Okay, so knight c3 was played, and that looks fine. So either the bishop from f3 attacks d5 and makes c5 not so effective, or the bishop attacks from that side, and then still the pawn on c3 cements the position of white pawn structure in the center and makes this bishop still bad. What they should do? What do you think? Now, if black doesn't want to lose the game, doesn't want to keep his pieces passive, which strategy black should come up with? Their bishop is their main problem. What would you suggest them? I agree, they should try to play e5, but e5 should be prepared, because right now e5 is a pawn sacrifice, and then such a pawn can be protected with f4. b5, well, b5, I think b5 knight c6 is a bit unpleasant. b5 is interesting. I didn't take a look at this move. In the game, it was played b6, which is definitely a mistake, but let's talk about this position. Knight c6, then rook d7 to protect on e7 and a7 simultaneously. And I think I can take, because after bishop c3, I want to trade rooks, because this rook is the defender of the pawn. And look at how well our bishop is placed. There is no rook c7. If he doesn't want to trade, he has to go that way. How should we continue in this position? Well, I like the idea of knight a5 back, but first we need to get rid of this bishop. What else do you suggest? We can just consider pushing the pawn, of course. Bishop f5 to do what? To trade bishops. Let's just get rid of this bishop by doing this move. He does b4, let's say. Then knight a5 works. And then what? Where does the rook go? So rook b8, rook d1. So I want to join this. So for example, this move, then rook d7, and they already have a problem. Rook b5 instead. Rook b5 in this position. So rook b5 is a double attack. How do I continue then? Okay, so I have to play this move. This, knight e7, king g7, let's say. Yeah, it's a possible move, I agree. Okay, so maybe not knight a5. What else I can do? Well, maybe just knight here. Now this move makes just a very little sense because I can push further. So rook d7 is a must. Then I can trade rooks and consider a rook d1. Why? Because if this move, then c6, and I take advantage of the pin and win material back. And also I have a passed pawn. So bishop moves. The rook can be trapped on b5, but the problem is that the knight is hanging, so I don't think, because they can always sacrifice the rook for a bishop then. By locating, well, they take the knight, then they locate the rook on a6. Okay, let me just show you what. Let me show you what Brian wants. You, on c5, bishop d6. Ah, I thought you were talking about that position when it was attacking. Okay, so maybe this move. And then you have bishop e5 actually. No, bishop e5 fails because rook e5 and you have your knight hanging. Oh, wait, but there is a bishop hanging. Okay, interesting. So this move has to be played. Knight e6, then this. And the knight is hanging. So it's not a trap, but I like bishop d6 move. We can create a double attack. Yeah, bishop d6, I missed this opportunity. It looks good. Yeah, fine, thank you. Okay, so what they should do actually in this position is that they should activate this bishop. How is it possible? It is possible if they play e5, prepared with rook e8. Not e5 right now because it's a pawn sacrifice, but e5 with rook e8. Also, even after that, e5 can be a problem because after d takes e5, bishop takes e5, bishop takes e5, there is a fork at the very end. So this tells us that after this move, they probably need to play knight there, then f4, and maybe f6. Well, f6 right now doesn't work. The king must move, then f6. Yeah, and bishop c7 can bring the mess, so well, there can be also maybe this strategy to try to activate pieces. This should be well calculated. Knight h3, pawn h3, this move, because it's likely that it is quite likely that one of these pawns is lost, and now these pieces are active. So if, for example, h4, which I think is a mistake, there is rook d2, and after rook d2, for example, in case of rook d1, there should be a perpetual check at the very least. Or even more than a perpetual check. Anyway, it looks dangerous because in such a case, the knight is not doing really much at on the edge of the board. Okay, fine. So in the game, it was played b6. Why is it a mistake? It is a mistake because it allows our knight to invade the enemy territory, and now he is forced to defend these two weaknesses. However, bishop b7 is coming. White here played f3. It restricts the knight, limits the bishop, and after bishop b7, let's say, which move do we have to play? Yeah, bishop a4, that's right, because now the rook is almost trapped, and maybe they have to take. This later happened. I mean, white achieved the bishop pair and could realize such advantage. Instead, bishop a6 was played, but bishop a6, knight b8, it's not a blunder. So the line continues with rook b8, bishop f1, king takes. So white achieved the bishop pair, but black developed their rook and got rid of their bad bishop from c8. Well, it wasn't really a bad bishop, but that bishop was doing a mess into the black's territory. So two bishops are stronger here, but that's not the end. How to realize this advantage? Well, rook b1, hoping to open the b file, and this is where black made a mistake. They took on d4, trying to, I don't know, open the position. But again, opening the position is favorable for this player who has a bishop pair, of course. Rook b7, bishop g3, and black starts advancing pawns. White to move. Let's come up with a plan. This time, white has advantage, and even if two engines were playing, white would win. Let's decide how you, well, which plan you have to come up with to get winning chances. Bishop d5 and try to win the pawn on b5, but how? Rook b6, let's say. Well, bishop c4, then maybe just a6 is enough. Because bishop c4, a6, a4, right? They can just move their... I see what you mean. So you mean that you can take on a6. So how do I have to play? Can I play knight c7? Yeah, actually it's quite possible. Knight c7, so if this, then rook takes and the bishop is hanging. So probably you have to take on b5 and then forced to take with a knight. So then this move. And then this move. Well, it's not trapped. The rook goes to f6. Yeah, I think it's a winning position. Yes. c3. When? Knight. Okay. 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 Yeah, there is no knight c7. Yeah, so you can actually attack this pawn with a4 and bishop c4. I think white chose a more solid line. A more solid line. So they played rook c1 to invade the enemy territory. A5 was played, rook c8, king h7. The king is further from the place of action compared to the white king. And white brings his material closer to the place of action. Now a4. And when white originally initiated all this strategy, he was definitely prepared against a4. So my question to you, what did white prepare? Okay, bishop d5, then rook b6. So what do you achieve with this move? Bishop e8. How can you deliver your bishop to e8? You mean bishop d5, rook b6, bishop here? and then bishop e8, but maybe it's too slow. Let's make the moves on the board and discuss it. So then bishop c6. So I wanted to play this move, but then the pawn on a4 is hanging. That's why I can instead play a3 move first, and then before b3 and promote the pawn. Maybe a4 is not the best way. What else I can do? Oh, there is this move, by the way. So takes, fork. Now bishop c6 is an accuracy, I think. Bishop d5 is possible, but after rook b6, it's not clear how to continue then. So then white made his position absolutely winning with no chances for black. And I can give you a hint saying that white wins because his king is closer to the place of action. Georgios suggests bishop e6. Bishop e6, f takes e6. Don't you think that the b pawn can be then promoted? Or please, can you explain it in more details why you think bishop e6 works? The king is quite close to the pawns, but the pawns being supported by the rook will distract some of the pieces. King d3, centralized, rook c7, and king is close. Okay, so you are almost correct. But not this, but this. Why? Because they cannot avoid the rook trade. They cannot even occupy an open file because of this bishop. So they have to trade. Because if you did rook c6, let's say, they would continue with b4, rook e6, b3, and this is unclear. So what you have to do, instead, you should quickly bring the king to b1 to blockade the pawn. But if so, then you don't have enough time to capture the pawn on e6. So rook b8, this pawn is not important. And this is a winning position, even if he doesn't play so. We just do this and capture both pawns, after which we have the outside pass pawn and the game is over. So b4, king d3, bishop h6. So they are trying to distract the king and capture on a3. Obviously, f4. Why? Because we don't lose a pawn, and at the same time, if you decide to compare e4 and f4, e4 allows the enemy bishop to get active, while f4 not. g5. In this position, it is possible to play g3 or g4. Yeah, g3 works, but g4 works too. That was played in the game. How does it work? H takes g4, h takes g4, g takes f4, g takes f4 is protected by the bishop, and that's it. This is where black resigned because they cannot stop this. Their bishop is out of place of action. If they try this move, then just bishop f5. And the black cannot make any progress, and the pawns are lost. So this bishop is just stuck. What he can do is to trade, but even if he does trade, then what? These pawns are captured, then this pawn is promoted. If the king comes to the c file, let's say, then we can start to promote the g pawn. For example, this b3, we take a3, just go back with the king and you're inside of the square of the pawn. This is how it works. So what I wanted you to remember about this game, well, if you have a simple position with a little or no tactics at all, you should think strategically. Ideally, you should play for weaknesses. You should attack the enemy weak pawns and occupy weak squares into the enemy territory with your pieces, having in mind that you improve your pieces if you do so. Okay, so Brian, there are two pawns. So the king cannot stop both of them. For example, king f7 b4, king e8 b5, king d7 g5. It's over. Okay, so what else you need to remember about simple positions? Usually, simple positions are endgames, but not obligatory. It can be just positions with symmetrical pawn structure. What we have to take into account when we play symmetrical positions? Okay, I will comment a little later. Um, we may say that the position is simple. It has no tactics or just some tactical ideas, but they do not work. However, they may work in future. What you have to take into account, you have to think about the pawn structure, whether you or your opponent has pawn weaknesses. Then also you have to think about the power of your pieces, how good your pieces are. For example, having two bishops in the open position will definitely help you to win. Also, pieces coordination and your ability to impose your plan, like your ability to keep your pieces active, to demonstrate some activity and provoke your opponent to make mistakes. Which plans you should initiate? So these are your factors that you have to consider when you play simple positions. But which typical plans you can think about when you are playing simple positions? You should add pressure on weaknesses, especially weak pawns. You should consider exchanges if you think that it transposes to a better endgame. You should activate your king. Should you consider the attack on the enemy king if there are some preconditions? For example, in this game, when the king is in the center, even with just two bishops and a rook, in some cases we can think of how to attack. And if we are not talking about checkmate, at least how to take advantage of the position of the king in the center. Maybe we will win some material based on it. You should also think about some pawn strikes, like sacrificing pawns in order to break the enemy pawn structure and make the enemy pawns weak. Of course, control open files and creation of passed pawns in order to defend in your position in case if you have simple position on the board. So in case of defending, what you should do is you should trade active pieces of your opponent. You should exchange your weak pawns, and you should find effective way of how to defend your weaknesses. Fine. So let's now talking about this concrete example. What do we have here? Okay. No, I promised to made a comment regarding Brian's remark regarding this position. So was this position simple? Well, I'm not saying it's very simple. It's still a multi-piece game, but it is simple because it doesn't. Okay, so Tony, please keep your microphone muted, otherwise I have to uh, ask you to leave. So why this position is simple? There is no tactics. There is no attack on the king side. You cannot even create any tactical strikes in the nearest future. So this is a type of the position where you have to think strategically. That's why they are called simple. The position that you are talking about is not simple. It's a precise position where you know what your plan should be. Just advance one pawn one by one. So the B, then the G, and so on. So okay, sorry about that. So I fixed this standard. Why don't I call it a strategic position? I don't know. There is no such terming. At least in Russian language, nobody says strategic position. No, I haven't. I haven't heard it. So I definitely understand what you mean. A strategic position, by your definition, means a position where strategic decisions should take place. So, but we are mainly talking about the position where the positions with either no tactics or just some hidden tactic that can be initiated later. Okay, let's continue with our second game. Paul Keres was playing against Borislav Ivkov. So Brian suggests bishop f6 to trade bishops. Well, I think it's actually a mistake. Why I think it is a mistake? Because I think that having a bishop pair will allow white to get winning chances. Because, well, should they take? Well, yes, they can. Why not? Let them take. Okay, John wants a4. Interesting. Okay, let me explain. So here, bishop f6. So I just want to see if I should include this. Bishop f4, let's say. Then h2, is it so beneficial? King h1. Then how should they play? Okay, maybe not. Maybe not. Well, maybe they just can play this move, and if you take, they can successfully locate their king there on d6. I just don't want to. Sorry, I just don't want to experience issues after rook f6, and definitely I don't want to fall under a check. So this, well, it's still playable and white is still better, but trading bishops, it's a very responsible decision, because while you have a bishop pair, you have definitely more chances to play for a win. But even bishop versus knight should be fine, because we can invade the enemy camp and g6 is a weakness. But I don't want to. I don't want to let black to advance the pawn further. In the game, it was bishop f4. Why bishop f4? Because, well, it's attack of g6. And again, I don't think that black wants to play this. Because then we have to play the endgame with bishops of the opposite color. Of course, we still have rooks on the board. That's why white has more chances to win the game, but one extra pawn may not guarantee a win. So it's too early to make such a decision. King d7 was played. They're trying to bring the other rook. And I don't think that there is any queenside activity, because if a4, a3 just. So rook f3. Rook g8 protecting on g6. Rook bf1. White achieved a lot. They activated their bishop and brought the rook to the open file, invading the enemy camp. So that's why this move was required. What white does here? Well, assuming that h3, h2 is coming, they made this move as a prophylaxis. Now, even if the pawn goes to h2, it doesn't really improve the black's position, because then what? A check from the back rank is needed. So a check on the first rank, but there is no check. The c1 is covered. There is a rook on f1 covering the back rank. So that's why the king on h1 will successfully block the pawn. h3. Let's come up with a plan. So h3 was played anyway. Let's now think about the plan. Still bishop f6 is Brian's suggestion. Okay, how does it work? Bishop f4, trade bishops and use the king. Okay, well, bishop f4 is this move. Then king h2. So you want to trade bishops. I actually don't want it. I would love to keep them. But maybe bishop f6 is fine. So bishop f6, king d7, you take on e5. They take with a pawn, and then you can continue with rook f6, let's say. And the position looks good. You can try to get the second rook to the 6th rank. Then take on g6, and most likely it will be winning. Yeah, looks like a plan. Yeah, so this time bishop f6 is stronger because you already have two rooks, and that means that you dominate on the f file, and you can bring the second rook and attack the enemy pawn weaknesses. So this time rook f6 works. Manish suggests d4. I agree with you, but let's not sacrifice the pawn. Oh, okay. So Michael suggests c4, then bishop d2, and then attack from that side. Okay. So let's say they don't take this pawn, because if they do, you have this and that. So let's say they don't take the pawn. Okay, let's say this b6. They defending it, and then how exactly do you initiate the attack on that side? It seems that you're ready to invade the enemy camp on f7, which is potentially a good strategy because because you can then attack the h pawn from behind. So a3, well, they can try even a4 to stop your activity, but even a4 is not required. There is opportunity for a Zugzwang. No, I don't think so, because they can keep making moves with their king, at least. Maybe some of their rooks can move. So at least not now. Black couldn't move anything in the previous position. You mean this? Well, it's not Zugzwang, but it's true. Black can hardly find any helpful move. They have to stay and wait. For example, the best move here was rook f7. Rook f7, king f7, and now d4, c takes, bishop goes to where? g7. If bishop goes there, then it's a pin and the game over. So bishop goes to g7, rook f1, king e8, and how would you continue then? King h2. Okay, so I don't think that this pawn is so important. Instead, you can play much better and win the game faster. Bishop f6. No, Brian, this time definitely no, because instead of bishop f6, there is a move which is several times better than bishop f6. For example, after bishop f6, you have like +2, maybe +3, but after a different move, you have like +7 or 8. Rook c1? What's the purpose of rook c1? To take on e7 and... to bring the rook to c7. But what if he does king d7 move? Wait. So you don't see it? I think you should work on geometrical tactical motives if you don't see it. Look at the enemy king. It's in a trouble. They lose material or checkmated. Okay, let me show you. It's bishop d3. Okay, thanks, Michael. Yes, it's bishop d3 and bishop b5. Exactly. For example, knight d5, which is actually a blunder, at least because of bishop c4, but bishop d5 is checkmate, actually. So, well, of course, this move is not required. Maybe they can try this, but how do they defend the position after this? Now, rook e8, it's bishop b5. Or rook g7. So bishop f8 is a must. Then what? Then bishop b5. So king goes that way to defend. And now it is a Zugzwang, kind of. Oh, wait a sec. Maybe there is a better move. After king d7. No, I can just try this. And if he goes that way, king d8, then rook f7. He does bishop f8. Oh yeah, and then now I have to come closer with the king and take this pawn, because king h2, rook h8, I have bishop f6, and I take the pawn anyway. Yeah, all pieces are paralyzed. He just cannot play any single move. Where rook h7 is better? In this position? I don't know. I don't think so. Instead of, well, because I want to keep the rook pressuring there. Instead of king h2. Why? Because if you retreat back, well, yeah, again, they cannot do much. They can move the king this time and try to get rid of the pin. Because when you keep the rook on the 7th rank, you stop it. So I think this is better, the king h2, bishop f6. The knight is hanging if the rook is on the 7th rank, but if you want to take on h3, then it's not. Okay, fine. So this is what would happen. In the game, it was king d7, d4, and almost the same thing. King h2 is a prophylaxis, rook c8, rook goes back, because now this pawn isn't important. After rook f7, they lose material. And this pawn can be promoted if there was a possibility of invasion, but because of these two bishops, it's limited. So they deliver a check, king goes back, rook f7, but rook c1 is not playable. That's why, well, if they play rook e8, they lose the game with the same way. Bishop here, d3, and then there. So that's why rook c4. They played bishop g6 in this position to save the bishop. Rook goes. Well, black is hoping for a checkmate on d1. This is their last chance. Your turn. How do we win the game this time? Do we have to retreat our rook back to f1? If so, we lose our bishop on g6. Yeah, I think it works. After bishop c2, they can try bishop c4 or rook c4. Then you can play bishop d3, rook d4, and bishop b5. Free knight with a check, but then how do you win, Arush? Well, they always threaten with this checkmate. It's a free knight and they cannot defend it. But what about... then bishop c2. Okay, let me think. Bishop here. Then king e8 can be played. Yes. If you don't have time to calculate, this simple solution will help you to win the game too. Well, definitely the king doesn't go under a discovered attack, so he goes to c8, but I think it's still possible because it's definitely a winning position. So let's see, this, and then let's advance the pawn, but you have to defend it. Yeah, I think it works because what you can do is this, the king is relatively safe. So this, king c7, this, then you advance, and then this is checkmate. So they cannot do much. Okay, yeah, that's a good strategy. In the game, white played even better. Bishop f5. They played better because they calculated. They had time to calculate. Again, king d8 is a blunder. So king goes to b8 and a check. Because if he goes that way, this is a pin. If he instead goes that way, then bishop a5 leads to checkmate. But even rook a5 was possible. Okay, fine. So when you have a bishop pair, don't trade bishops, please. In some positions, it may help you to, well, win faster, to take advantage of the enemy weaknesses. But before deciding to trade your bishop for the enemy bishop or for the enemy knight, doesn't matter. Think of what you achieve compared to the current situation when you have a bishop pair, because maybe later in the game there will be a better moment to convert your bishop pair and take and trade the bishops to get more advantage. So think about it. Maybe it's better to keep the bishops. In that line, when bishop f6 was suggested by Brian in last time, it was possible. Okay, fine. So again, this is a simple position and tactic appeared at the very end. What we were trying to do here, again, we were trying to activate our pieces, blockade the h-pawn and try to invade the enemy camp through the open file. So f7 and f6. This is our last example. Before we continue, I would like to remind you that our workshops are absolutely free. However, if you like this content and you would like to support it, you can do it using, for example, PayPal or Wise by clicking on this link. I'm going to copy it in the chat. So this is PayPal. How does it work? You just click on this. Then you enter the amount you want to donate. It redirects you to enter your PayPal account. You click on it. A new pop-up window appears where you enter your PayPal account and send money directly to my PayPal account. I would appreciate any donates. Also, for those of you who have Wise, you can just use this link to donate through Wise. I like Wise more because Wise doesn't take much fee. What else? Today is the last day of that sale on Chessable. So if you're thinking about purchasing any of my courses on Chessable, today is the last day when they are sold with a discount. But only these three. This one about calculation and evaluation, I can send you the link to. So while this course teaches how to evaluate and improves your calculation skills. The next one is about London system, how with black pieces to defeat London system, but it's about d4, d5. If your response against d4 is knight f6, for example, then, well, partially this course can be helpful for you, but it's mainly for d4, d5 players. So this is on sale too. Today is the last day. And finally, the last one, the victorious Cancicelian. So if you want to build your opening repertoire with black pieces against e4, then this is my best course about Cancicelian, my recommendation. So moreover, it's relatively cheap. Fine. Let's continue with our topic. We have one more game to go through. That was the game by Anatoly Karpov and Florin Georgiou. Okay, so Carlos asks if I have any courses on Chessbase. No, I don't have. I don't work with them. I don't know why. They just didn't, well, I didn't contact them. They didn't offer anything to me. So I have courses on the chess world, for example. But on chess base at the moment, I don't. Okay, fine. I don't know why. Well, maybe they can be interested in it. But I even don't know who is that person who is responsible for collaboration with new authors. So if you have contact, I can message him. Well, let's try to evaluate this position. We can hardly call it simple, but there is no tactics. There are strategic weaknesses such as b6 and d6 pawns. Well, maybe b6 is not a big weakness, but d6 definitely is because it's located on a semi-open file. The c pawn is also located on the semi-open file, but it's protected by the b pawn. That's why it's not a weakness. The white's position is quite promising, and there should be a long-term pressure on these pawns, especially on d6. What do you think white plan here should be? Well, it's white. So black played this move, it's white to move. What's our plan? Knight g5, knight e4. Win the pawn on d6. Okay, let's see how it works. Double the rooks on the d file. I actually agree. Double the rooks makes a lot of sense because the c file is unlikely to be open, so at least not now. Doubling the rooks, I would also consider it, but not as my first priority. So let's see, knight g5. How does it help to win a pawn? Let's say they play what? Let's say they play knight c5. Then what can you do? I doubt that this is a good idea because it weakens the pawn on c4. Knight e4 now? No, it doesn't work. So actually you have to retreat or what? Or you have to prepare. Yeah, knight c5 stops this plan. Okay, maybe let's say they play stupid move h6. And now you play knight g4. How does it work? Let's say rook c6 and they are defending it. And then they are about to trade and maybe offer another trade and bring the king closer. If they bring the king to e7, I think they can solve this problem with a weak pawn on d6. So looks like knight g5 doesn't work. Doubling rooks, yes. Any other suggestions of what we should try to achieve here? Bishop a3 pinning the pawn. Again, the problem is that they have knight c5, so it's not such a pin. And if you take, they take with the d and get rid of it. Okay, so here I want, well, such a position where long-term planning makes a lot of sense because there is no immediate punishment. They cannot play neither b5 nor d5. So what I would like to achieve is something like that with my king on a3. H3 can be played, but well, what for? At the moment, I don't see a purpose of playing H3. H3, G4, G5, then, well, chasing the knight makes a lot of sense, but I would rather play H3, G4, G5 with queens on the board. In this position, probably not. So in the game, it was played knight d4. The key idea was to advance the pawns. And black tried this. Well, maybe he's preparing this move. Maybe he wants to do this. I don't know. The rook on e8 is not really doing much. So he's just playing waiting moves. Rook ac1. This h6. Well, they better play knight c5. Well, okay, so e4. Yeah, they'd better play knight c5. If they did knight c5 in this position, then in order to play e4, we have to start with this, then bring the king, and only then consider f4. And of course, this time h3 is required because we want to avoid checks on g4. But h6, e4, and knight e8, and now we don't need h3. Knight e8 wasn't a good move. Again, knight c5 would be a better strategy. So in this position, they played knight e8, but knight c5, f3, defending it, g5, threatening with g4. For example, rook c2, g4 can be played, and if you take, they take the central pawn. They ruin their pawn structure on the king side, but take your important pawn on e4. Well, maybe instead of rook c2, you could just play h3 here. But h3, h5, and there is still a problem. That would be the best strategy for black, and their position is quite solid. They don't have space, but it's solid. And they could play for a draw. But they play knight e8, losing space, moving the knight to a passive position, but intending to improve the bishop. But even in this position, with precise play, black should withstand the white's pressure. But this is where psychology comes. It is hard to play for, well, it's hard to draw the game when you always have to defend the position without any winning chances, because black is not threatening to, well, black is not going to win. There are no winning chances. What they have to do is just passively stay and wait. Luckily, their position is solid enough. What did happen? Well, rook b7. Bishop a3, adding pressure, the rook goes that way, and now let's maneuver with our pieces. So I'm sure you understand why black decided to double the rooks. Brian, you suggested e5, I missed it. At which point? And for who? For white or for black? I don't think it's a good idea for black because of knight a5 and knight d5. So maybe for white? Instead of rook to the 7th rank, instead of rook b7, e5. Well, but why do you like it? Let's say I play this move, you have to defend there. And if you defend it like that, then I can go that way. Threatening with knight e7. Of course, you can defend. But it seems that I improved my knights a lot. Now maybe even bishop a3. So I'm intending to take and then win a pawn on d6. Yeah, so, well, again, this is the hedgehog. We did a workshop devoted to the hedgehog. And we know that in hedgehog, black tries to play d5 to get dark squares open. However, well, e5 weakens this and this a lot. That's why, well, it can be considered only in case if there is a concrete idea behind this move. Maybe it starts a tactical combination. If not, then e5 is likely to weaken light squares and more make the position weak. Knight c5 is always a good move. But for now, I just don't see the purpose. Fine. So rook b7 was played. Bishop a3, rook goes to c7, and what would you play for white? That was my question. What black wants with their rook c7 move? Yeah, definitely b5 or d5 break, but here b5 looks better, I think. b5 and to make c4 pawn a weakness because the knight is hanging. That's why let's get prepared and move the knight. Now b5 is just a pawn blunder. Knight c5 was played. What then? Let's just maneuver. The position is closed, and step by step, slowly, we are improving our pieces. So g6, it's a helpful move. For king move mainly. Knight doesn't go there. There is nothing to do. The bishop can. Then the knight can go to f6, but it weakens the d6, and this is what black has to take into account. Knight c2. Bishop goes to g7. Knight goes to e3, and we are preparing for f5 move to weaken the d5 square and occupy it with our knight. Maybe we should do g4 f5. Maybe we can prepare these moves first, because g4 h5, g4 and then h4. Well, so you want to deliver a checkmate with two rooks? Well, yeah, g4 definitely yes, but h4 I don't see the point. With g5 then, but again, what for? So this is where black took a critical decision. They played f5 to stop g4 and to stop us from playing f5 ourselves. It's not a mistake, but this affects the pawn structure. However, black gains space. Take. It's hanging just. G takes f5. This move was played. And now h3. So now the concept of this strategy is that now the G file is likely to be open, and because white has still more space on the board, they can quickly transfer their pieces to the king side, not to checkmate the king, but to invade the enemy camp and attack pawn weaknesses. If maybe together with this, there can be some attack on the king, but not with the idea of delivering checkmate, but with the idea of forcing the king to move to such a position where other tactical strikes can be delivered. So h5, rook g1, preparing to play g4, to take on g4 with a rook, for example. Rook f7, g4 was played. Take, 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 rook takes. Now white well, does a kingside play. I cannot fully say that this is attack on the enemy king. It's just a kingside play. King f8. So what do you think? How to continue then? One of the problems of the black's position is that their knight is tied down to the d6 pawn. Brian said knight d4. What do you mean? Which knight d4? White should play knight d4. Okay, got it. What for? Then rook dg2. So like that. But yeah, like that. But not rook g2 because you leave your knight hanging. Well, I think if so, they can play king e7 to defend on e6. And you cannot play this move, you just lose. But now knight e4, rook g7. I don't see what do you mean knight e4 followed by. No. Okay, fine. So I think you're right. You should bring the knight, but maybe not through d4. Through with the idea of pushing f5. Yeah, well, because then you can play f5. They played this move, I don't know what for, but it's hard to make a move, because originally I thought that maybe this is a good strategy, but that weakens d6. I even think that it's possible to take on... once again, so knight d4, then what? Bishop d4. g2, you mean? Ah, black can play rook g7, like that? Yeah, it's possible. Maybe e5 is already possible. No, e5, oh, f5 is not, doesn't work. Yeah, absolutely. So e5 works actually, because then there is 96 also. And with more simplification, I mean, with more pieces traded, the game can end in a draw. Not sure if it's the best way. The best way is to play maybe 96 or take. I don't know what is better. Maybe just let's trade everything. Well, e4, and I don't know what for, because you make this a pass pawn. So let's say king g3, and then they play f5. And e4 is always hanging, because this trade may appear, and this trade may happen, and this is how you lose a pawn. Okay, fine. Knight g3 was played with the idea of doing f5. a5, rook g6, and well, rook g6, you were attacking the pawn on e6. So you see, we are not really checkmating the king. We are trying to initiate an attack of the enemy weaknesses through the king side. King goes to e7 and then f5. Yes, if they take, the king can be under attack. This is one of the ideas. So we are not only attacking weaknesses, but this time, if only we see that the king becomes vulnerable, we take advantage of that. So they take, then I think it's game over. So knight takes, which knight? This knight maybe. Then king goes to f8, and just king g2 is sufficient. Knight d6 is coming. Oh, maybe just this. And the f5 pawn can be captured later. Okay, fine. So rook f6 was played. They traded. And this is where they made mistake. They took with a knight, having in mind that their knight isn't well placed, but capturing with a bishop was important. I'm going to explain why. Well, this time this bishop is not really doing much, so let's trade it and bring the rook to invade the enemy territory. E takes f5, rook h7, king e6, and with knight d5, then we can win the pawn on e5 anyway. Well, maybe with rook h5 and rook knight f7. But with this move, I wanted to paralyze the black's actions. So rook e7 can be played once the bishop moves, for example. White has some domination here. This pawn is likely to be lost soon. Also, rook a7 is a threat, after which you can create a pass pawn. So even bishop f6 didn't help black to draw the game, but they took with a knight. That was a mistake. Rook e2, threatening with a discovered attack. What do you think was the safest way for black to defend the position here? Finally, we do take advantage of the enemy king's position, but this attack is devoted not to a checkmate, but to taking advantage of the enemy weaknesses. So Carlos and Dan think that e5 should be played. I didn't look at this move actually. I don't know. Well, Brian thinks knight d3. Okay, let's talk about knight d3. Knight d3. You're not threatening with anything, so can I just take? I'm threatening with this. Maybe with this too. Ah, 95. Okay, king g2 or f2, g2, g2, g2. And then I'm still threatening. So if you take there, I think I can do just this. Let's now talk about e5. It does make sense. Knight d5, knight takes knight. Okay, so with such a structure, maybe this bishop is not the most important piece. Rook takes, because if d takes, then it weakens this pawn. Taking with the b works, but then the d6 pawn is still a backward pawn. So that's why I want to take with a rook, but then knight e4. Well, I think that white wins in such a position because they get the control over critical squares and they can invade the enemy camp. b6 is still a weakness, so maybe capturing with the b pawn was better, but does it change anything? Not really much. b6 is not hanging, that's it. Still the same strategy. Okay, so they'd better play this move. Why? Because after let's say this move, there is knight e5 and knight e6. And then the E file is overloaded with knights, and that's why there is no such an attack. So if knight d5, which I think is better, king goes to f7. So if this, it's knight takes. And after knight takes, there is a fork. So that's why let's liquidate, but then one knight replaces the other one, and still there is the same problem. And after bishop f8, they defend. So now with just fewer pawns left, the game may end in a draw. I wanna play this move, to take and to fork. Maybe actually this is a better move with this idea. So not sure, but what you should remember is that two knights cannot exchange. We have only a few pawns left, and if let's say black manages to trade their rooks and then exchange knight and bishop for 3 pawns, it's still a draw. So knight fd7 was anyway better. Rook f8 was played, and that was a blunder. Let's take advantage of this blunder. What would you play? Yeah, so two knights cannot checkmate a king. That's right. So f takes e6 looks attractive, but it looks like we don't need this bishop. So let's trade this bishop and then take on e6. And, well, this pawn decides the game because they cannot take it. They did, and I'll show you what happened. Well, you may think about some discovered attacks that may appear. No, unfortunately, because there is always a possibility of delivering a cross check. So king moves, then it's e7, the rook moves, and then you can do what you want. For example, take on h5 and then take on g7. So because of this cross check, there is no discovered attack. I mean, effective discovered attack for black. So they took with the king, they got this. Now, doesn't matter where the king goes, it's rook e7 and the game is over. For example, this, and the g7 bishop is lost, after which the game is completely losing. King d7, it's basically the same idea. Well, maybe you can take with the knight, but well, it opens the f file, so it's better to take with a rook and avoid further calculations. Okay, so again, what you should do when you play a simple position. This example illustrates us that because it's a mainly closed position, what white was trying to do was to maneuver with their pieces, putting pieces to a better position. And once such a situation happened, for example, like that, there was another possibility of activating pieces on the king side and attacking the enemy weaknesses through the king side. Because white has more space, they can quicker move their pieces to the king side. That was the main concept. This is what helped Anatoly Karpov to win this game. Fine. So what I want you to learn, if you have a simple position with no tactic, it doesn't obligatory mean that you should create any tactic. Think strategically instead. Improve your pieces. Attack enemy weaknesses. Occupy weak squares into the enemy territory. If there are no weaknesses, create them by attacking some of the pawns, provoking them to move, or by offering the pawns exchange, or even sacrificing pawns, but getting weak squares that you can occupy with your pieces and improve these pieces. So this is what you should try to do. If it's the end game, don't forget about your king. You should use your king as an ordinary piece. And you know the king has the same power as a rook in the end game. Not in this endgame, but with fewer pieces being exchanged, he has the same power, the same strength as the rook. Fine, so we are done for today. Do you have any questions?